Welcome back to the Fishing Daily podcast with me, your host, Oliver McBride. Today I'm joined by Brendan Byrne from the IFPEA, and we'll be discussing what's happening in the industry with him. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you, Oliver. Glad to be back.
Brendan, this revelation in the Sunday Times that the food for the restaurants in the Óireachtas in Leinster House was going to be brought in from thousands of miles away. Surely, somewhere along the line, your members must be asking questions about why this is.
Well, I suppose, to be fair, we were shocked. In reality, we're a maritime nation. We have great fish processing potential there. And to realise, as revealed in this article, that the fish in our national parliament is by and large from third countries, then we have to be cognizant of the fact that this was probably tendered for. So there is obviously a flaw in the tendering process where priority should be given to native stocks by having, for example, an Irish fish emphasis on these tenders. I know you're going in the competition law there, and European law would be very tight regulation in that regard, but it is possible. I think it's a sad indictment of our national parliament that the majority of fish sold there from third countries defies logic. That being said, we as an industry need to challenge this, and that will be done. I think we're now contemplating writing to the Can Corla and the Clerk of the House in order to correct this. It's a national scandal if the main menu item for fish in our national parliament is fish from South Africa or for New Zealand, wherever the case may be. It should be used as a platform to promote Irish products, be that fish or beef or vegetables for that matter. And if it's a tendering issue that's there in terms of the Houses of the Oireachtas and the committee that runs the Houses of the Oireachtas, then that needs to be looked at. The food served in the national parliament, or the drink served in the national parliament, should be a platform for advertising the best of Irish. And that's what we need to get into. That's the space we need to get into, regardless of what regulations there is in terms of tendering or public procurement. It's possible when you go to the House of Commons, or indeed if you go to any other national parliament in other countries, they're using it as a platform to advertise the best products of their own countries. And that's what we should be doing here in Ireland. But there's an awful lethargicness right across the different departments that they don't promote Irish. They talk enough about it, and Lord knows if you put a plane on the tarmac in Dublin Airport to promote Irish food in Tokyo or in Washington, it'd be full of officials. Not very many of them thought of going down to the national parliament to see what food was being served there, did they?
Well, there's also the question that, we've got the Green Party as part of the government, and they're hammering the country on carbon emissions. And yet now it seems to be okay to fly in hoki from New Zealand or whatever, prawns from Thailand or whatever, to put on their plates. That seems to be that'd be an insult as well to both the fishing industry and the processing industry.
But it's high time the Green Party woke up and realised that they are in government and stopped hammering the farmers, for example, and looked to see what exactly is happening in terms of fish. If you look, typically the fish being caught off our coast, and I'm glad now the department have done a U-turn and finally admit that the majority of fish caught in Irish waters is caught by vessels from other member states. And typically you see vessels leaving Spain and France and Denmark and Germany and France, steaming to within 40, 50 kilometres of the Irish coastline, catching fish and steaming back to their own countries to process it, while we have an entire Irish fleet within kilometres of this catch, and we're prohibited, not allowed to catch it because of an archaic common fisheries policy and relative stability that hasn't been reviewed since 1983 because the big entities in Europe are controlling the EU Commission, and that's the reality. The big players in Europe have the Commission hamstrung, and until that is shattered and that is undone, member states such as Ireland will be will be minority players in the common fisheries policy. So there's a whole debate and discussion about carbon footprint, and we see our cousins in the farming industry, they're getting completely hammered and wiped out in terms of that. But there's a blind eye being turned to what's happening in the fishing industry. You have vessels then leaving Japan to come within 200 kilometres of Ireland fishing tuna, while at the same time we can't fish the tuna that's by and large in Irish waters until it goes out to international waters. And then you have Japanese vessels coming here and catching up to 3,000 to 4,000 tonne of it, while we can't catch any of it. So the Green Party are talking about carbon footprint, but they're also choosing to ignore the reality of what's happening in terms of carbon footprint. And the fish that's served in the Dáil is a classic example of how blind they are to their own policies.
Well, yeah, you only have to look at the policy of stopping Irish people cutting turf and then importing turf from Poland or Germany or Eastern Europe or wherever it's coming from. And, you know, there's a carbon footprint to that. You've kind of got a lot of questions in regards to those policies.
Well, if you look at the overall carbon footprint output of Ireland, it's less than 0.8%. So as a global player, we're very insignificant. But like everything, the Irish overregulate themselves no end. And the amount of regulation we have, be it in peat extraction, be it compost generation, we've seen it now with a 25% cut in emissions for the farming industry. You have an effective 30% cut in the whitefish fleet because that's going to be decommissioned by 30%. And as I said and outlined there earlier, you have multiple vessels from various coastal states right across Europe fishing within kilometres of our coastline, while we ourselves that would be most adjacent to it and would have the least carbon footprint if we were allowed to fish. So all of that needs to be talked about. We have a very pro environmental commissioner, Sinkevicius, and there is talk that the carbon footprint of fishing needs to be a factor in any review of the common fisheries policy. And if that were to occur, it can only help Ireland, because at present you have the multiple stocks of fish around the Irish coast. You have thousands of vessels travelling thousands of miles round trip in order to get here to fish, and the most adjacent or nearest fleet is tied up for at least 10 months of the year by and large.
Talking about over-regulation, we've seen now where the client Earth and the low impact fishers of Europe have taken action against the Dutch authorities for what they're claiming is fish fraud. That fish is herring and mackerel. Most of that's caught in and around Irish waters. Why are we so over-regulated, and why does it seem to be, reading from what they've said, that authorities in Holland and these other countries are not as highly regulated?
Because there's an inbuilt stupidity in the Irish people, and you see it typically. I've seen it in the last 18 months that I'm in this job, that you have the SFPA, whichever European-wide remit, let's face facts, but unless they do it by accident, they're not going to board vessels from other member states. The Sea Fishery Protection Authority, through their management and through their way they approach control and regulation, feel that it's only necessary to hammer the Irish fishing industry, to hammer the Irish fishing vessels, while all the time, and you see it in any port, go to the south of Ireland, go anywhere, vessels from France and Spain and Belgium offloading their cargo, and they haven't a clue, and they don't want to know either, the SFPA, what's in that. You could have anything in it. And in terms of the Dutch, and look at what's happening now, what's been revealed now, is an open secret in the industry for the last 15 to 20 years. Let's call it for what it is. And that you have the SFPA, I would like to see them tell me, how many times did they board a Dutch vessel? How many times did they check exactly what's in every carton of fish in these Dutch vessels? And I think the answer that you would get would be embarrassing. And let's call it out for what it is. These are member states that are catching the majority of their fish in Irish waters. They have multiple times the size quota that the Irish nation has. Let's look at the maths. Ireland typically is catching 15% of the fish that's caught around Ireland. So therefore, 85% is caught by other member states. And the percentage of those vessels that are boarded, examined by the Irish SFPA is embarrassment. It's a national embarrassment and has been since the very first day. And yet you look at the 15%. That's the percentage of fish that's caught by the Irish vessels. They are hammered. They are crucified by the SFPA on a daily basis. And no political party and no government has seemed to look into that. Why? Because we're no longer good Europeans. We're submissive Europeans, whereby we have to be seen to do the European thing while all at the same time we hammer the Irish industry. You know, the Eurostat figures were published within the last 10 days. And I continuously talk about this because every time I meet the SFPA, they talk about wholesale endemic fraud within the Irish industry. That's what they've lived on. That's what they have justified their own incompetence for the last 20 years. But let's look at the statistics. Since 2014, over the past 8 years, the Irish fish processing industry has declined by 16%. It has fallen by 16%. We're now the 10th in size of scale, the 10th in Europe. There's 9 countries larger than us. Belgium is larger than us, and it has only 67 kilometres of a coastline. The Irish coastline is 4,400 kilometres. The Belgium have less than 1% of the EU waters. We have 12% of the EU waters. And yet our industry is declining. And if I were to meet the SFPA tomorrow morning, and when they are briefing our politicians, as one of the prominent members of the SFPA did in the last month, to talk about manipulation and control evasion on the part of the Irish, I would like to ask one question. If there is, as the SFPA allege, this degree of manipulation in the Irish industry, where the hell is the fish? If our industry in 8 years has fallen by 16% and has fallen from a position of being the 3rd highest in Europe to now being the 10th place in Europe, where is the fish? There is no fish. You have a control authority that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been able to manage itself. Report after report, it said it's completely dysfunctional, completely lacking management. And you now have a situation where I thought, to be fair, under new management, that we would have some hope of getting a grip on a control authority, because we're all for sustainability, we're all for control measures. But in order for control and sustainability to be effective, it has to be applied equally to all member states, not just Ireland, not just Ireland. And the Dutch case is an example of it. The hundreds of vessels that come into our port that are not checked as an example of it. Yet at the same time, as a member state, we're completely overregulated, but yet we have this narrative that's been pimped or sold at European level that we're not compliant. Ireland is the most compliant of all EU states, and that will be proven beyond any doubt in the next number of months and years ahead. And that will be to the embarrassment of the conduct of some within the department and most within the SFPA, because what they have been at for the last 15 years is nothing short of treacherous.
This claim that, that there's extra fish being landed, there's, it's being processed and everything else to get there. But surely, if that's happening, wouldn't the extra fish not turn up on the books or on the fish exports to out of Ireland? What was that the European Union has claimed, the European Commission has claimed, has been overfished, tens of thousands of tons. Well, where did it go? It's a claim that they have to back those figures up by looking at exports and fish sales. And so far, I haven't seen any of that coming forward.
It's a national embarrassment. and I hope someday that the full truth of what's been going on in terms of this narrative that's been sown against the Irish industry for the last 15 years. It's a national embarrassment what has really been going on behind the scenes at European. You and I attended an event in Brussels recently. We got firsthand from the EU Commission and the people within DG Mara the view that's there. And there is an open view to Ireland within the European Commission, but the flaws are very much within our own department, within our own control authority, and indeed, let's call it out, the weakness of politicians for successive generations in failing to realise the true value of the asset that we have in fishing. And until we deal with those three problems, it's pointless going to Europe. But going back to the hard, cold statistics, data that's compiled by Eurostat, independently of anything here in Ireland, our industry is in permanent decline for the last 20 years, particularly in the last 8 years. And yet you have a crowd of idiots, and I'm being polite there, going around saying there's whole-scale corruption in Ireland. There isn't whole-scale corruption, but what is in Ireland is whole-scale incompetence on the part of the control authority that has not been dealt with. The government, the present government, have invested great resources in the SFPA in order to deal with the PricewaterhouseCoopers report. But what they did, and this is going to be regrettable in time, they chose to renew the structure from internally without changing the foundation, without changing the basis of it. And it's setting itself up for complete failure again. Look, it may take another year, it may take 2 to 3 years to prove that point. But the SFPA are on the road to failure again, and that's the reality. And until we get a properly functioning control authority, it's going to be a black mark against Ireland. And that's through no fault of industry, through no fault of the processors or producers. It's through fault of lack of political awareness that we need to have a robust, perfectly managed and well organised, I would imagine, control authority, and that's just not there. And I have been objective as I can in the last period that I've worked with them. I had great confidence when we had an executive director that was brought from the outside to here, to Ireland. He certainly knew his job. Unfortunately, he's no longer there, but unfortunately also, the SFPA have gone back to the old ways of functioning, which is most concerning.
Well, as you said, we were at the meeting in Brussels where we did hear from DG Mari. Now, it did pretty much come across that they were aware of the problems within the Irish structure from the department down to the SFPA. And it seems to be endemic that the Irish fishing industry, Irish processing industry is going to be suffering as long as that structure's in place, as you say. And one of the things now that, you know, your members is facing, as well as the fishing industry is facing, is the fuel costs, and the government stepping back and not intervening now when the industry needs it most. Your members must be finding it pretty tight now at the moment.
Absolutely. And the reality is, in terms of the processing sector, the export sector, or indeed the fish retail sector, it's just a sector that's not talked about as much, but without an effective fish retail network within the coast, a lot of the fish product that was landed can't be sold. So if you take those three sections together and equally, there has been absolutely no measure put in place by the government to help assist that sector in terms of the consequences of Brexit, which were massive and are ongoing and are reoccurring. Coupled on top of that, you had COVID, and now you have the greatest energy crisis since the Second World War. And the reply from the government for the processing, exporting and retail sector is nothing. They're ignoring it. They are hoping that the clock will run down and the energy crisis will stop, and then they'll say, well, you survived that. while at the same time other European countries are putting in place measures to help both the catching sector and the processing, retail and exporting sector. But Ireland isn't in that space. Ireland believes that the industry, well, obviously they must believe that the industry is robust enough, but there's a principle within Europe called the level playing field. And let's put it this way. If the French are going to support their industry, not alone are they supporting it, but they're also extending the period of that support. The Spanish are going to support their industry. The Dutch are contemplating it, and the Danish are moving into that space. Those are 4 countries that I just attended a recent European-wide meeting that have very clear plans either in place with measures or support already paid. And here we have Ireland sitting on its hands through lack of political leadership. And let's look at what's on offer. On the 23rd of March, the Commissioner instructed states to use the MFAF money or to draw from the other European maritime funds that will be available over the next period. Ireland chose to say, no, we don't need that. We'll use that for pet projects, and that's a slush fund for keeping everything else oiled for the next 4 or 5 years, and we'll ignore industry. That's the attitude that's killing this industry. That is the attitude at department level that has left us where we are. And where are we? We're a declining industry. We're an industry that our only policy for anything is decommission. And we're an industry that has gone from 3rd place in the processing leagues of Europe to 10th. And we're going to go further. I predict within the next 2 years that Lithuania will overtake us. They're in 11th position at the minute. Their processing sector is worth 571 million. They're just 80 million behind us. They're going to overtake us, and they have very little territorial waters. So this is what's happening. And the sad thing about it is it's happening in plain sight. It's happening in real time. And industry, and I put myself in there, are not calling it out. If this were to happen in any sector in agriculture, any other sector in the Irish economy, there would be open revolt, and there would be serious clamouring for change within the department, for change within government policy, for change within the interaction with Europe. But yet, whatever is wrong with the Irish industry is it's so suppressed through whatever mismanagement there has been for the past 20 years. It's so suppressed that it's just allowed to happen. And that's what's wrong. And that's what will continue to be wrong until industry becomes stronger than those that are out there that are either not doing their job or are seeking to destroy the industry. Whichever hat. There's no 2 options here. It's one or other. But the Irish industry of fishing and processing and producing is under serious pressure. And it's one of the failures of the EU in terms of how our membership of the EU and EEC as it was before. It's the one industry that has completely failed, but part of the fault lies with ourselves because we have allowed it to happen in real time, in plain sight, without challenging it.
A decommissioning scheme will only add to that decline. It'll accelerate it, but also if the government, which the Green Party is part of, expect your members to start importing fish from abroad in order to process it and add value and then sell it, surely that's not reasonable to think that that will happen.
Well, in reality, it has to happen unless we're intent on losing the entire fish processing sector. If we're fish processors, then we need fish to process. And as you saw from the TCA and the transfers, where we're losing 15% of our 2020 baseline quota and the sheer loss of that value, if we were to sustain the processing sector at the levels that it was in 2020, fish will have to be brought in from other EU countries or other countries across the globe. That's the reality. It's an unpopular thing to say, and people will be annoyed that that is the stance that we have to take. But that's the reality, unfortunately, that every Irish fish processor is facing at the minute, that the supplies are diminished. And now you have a decommissioning of 1/3 of the whitefish fleet on top of that, which is an absolute scandal. And the irony is that the day that the decommissioning scheme was announced, the task force on the common fishery policy, or the group that was to look into the reviewing of that in terms of options for additional quota, well, it was released on the same day. So you had two policies of government that are juxtapositioned against one another. One, a decommissioning 1/3 of the Irish fleet, 60 vessels in number, while at the same time you had the group charged with looking at options for quota potential to see how we can expand our quota and total allowable catch, published in the same day. But sure, if you're decommissioning your fleet, what extra quota will you want? That's going to be the first thing that DG Mara, the EU Commission, and all other EU coastal states are going to ask of Ireland. You're coming back here looking for burden sharing or levelling up, whichever phrase you wish to call it, but yet you have solved your own problem by decommissioning 60 of your vessels. So in terms of what's happening now in the present, our policies are contradicting one another. We're flapping around like a seagull in oily water. We're just not taking off here.
Surely, if your members are relying on importing fish or getting foreign boats to come in, like Spanish boats or French boats to come into land, they do get a higher premium for their fish. Is there maybe a problem where you could be held to ransom price-wise for what you're buying?
Well, the only saving grace in that, and if you look at the data that was released to the Common Fisheries Review Group, there are member states in Europe that have so much quota that they can't catch it all. And some countries are having, depending on the species, they can have 20 to 30%. On average, they have 12 to 15% of their national quota that they don't even catch, because their quotas are so large that they haven't the capacity to catch it all, nor do they have the capacity to process it all. That's in terms of whitefish. In terms of the pelagic sector, you look at the unilateral setting of quotas by the Norwegians and by the Faroese, and you look at what's happening in blue whiting. Here we are sitting with about 28,000 tonne of blue whiting. 80% of it is in the Irish EEZ at any one time, and the Norwegians have probably a quota of around 200,000 tonnes. We have a demand within the processing sector here in Ireland for about 60 to 70,000 tonnes. So that's, as a species, to underline the point that I've been making, that's the species that we have to probably attract 2.5 times the quota that we have as a member state, even though by zonal attachment, the blue whiting is very much an Irish passport carrying fish. And yet we allowed ourselves to get into a situation where we're struggling to hold a quota, I might add, of 28,000 tonnes. And it's a species, as I see it, looking at the DNA of it, which is very closely aligned to the Alaska cod. It's a potential species that has great potential in the time ahead, and it's going to have a bright future, but we're not at the races in terms of what we can catch in our own waters, and how that was allowed to develop at a time when Ireland was asked to carry the largest burden in terms of the TCA. How anyone left the negotiating table to say, oh yeah, that's all right, we'll take 15% of the Irish total allowable catch, and meanwhile see that 200,000 tonne that the Norwegian take out of our water, that's still fine, let them keep that while we struggle along in 28,000 tonne. I would love an honest to God review of what really happened in December of 2020, because it defies all logic that you have a country that has 12% of the EU waters, yet we are a minority shareholder in our own waters, and then when it came to blue whiting, sure, we've the beggar's bowl, that's all we have, because we're down at around 10%.
So what your members are looking at in the future is importing fish from abroad in order to process it. But the majority of that fish is probably going to be caught in Irish waters.
Absolutely.
And under this origin green policy that the government has, does that make sense?
Of course it doesn't make sense. And as I said, throughout the discussion, if carbon footprint is to mean anything, it must mean that the Irish fishing vessels catch the fish off their coast instead of the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and the Germans and the Danes. But the policy as it is allows them to catch the fish while we're tied up or we're on reduced quotas. So if we are to sustain the fishing industry at processing level, and you look at the Poles and you look at the Lithuanians, 60% of the fish that they're processing is imported from other countries. They've developed a successful model in that. The reality that's facing the processing, exporting and retail sector, all three are equal in my eyes, is that if we are to remain in the fish industry, we have to attract other vessels from other member states to our ports and harbours so that we can buy from them fish that more likely than not was caught in the Irish waters. The only difference is they're allowed to catch it, and until we get a policy that's more fair to the Irish fishing industry, we're not allowed to catch it. So I see this as a two-pronged approach. One, that we get our own house in order so that at least we bring a credible argument to Europe to correct the wrongs over a period of time and build up the resilience of the Irish fishing industry by whatever means, by long-term lease, by levelling up, by zonal attachment, by building up the total allowable catch across the various sectors. That's the first thing. But meantime, we have to sustain the Irish processing sector, and that can only be sustained if we, in the interim period, attract vessels from other coastal states in Europe in order to keep the critical level of the processing sector. And as I said, we are a processing sector that has declined 16% in the last 8 years. 7 out of the last 8 years, year on year, the processing sector has declined. The trajectory is frightening. We have already, and that 16% decline, I should add, does not include the transfer under the TCA. The Eurostat figures next year will incorporate that. So not alone have we declined 16% up to 2019, but thereafter we're going to decline, as we know, because we have already lost 15% of our national total allowable catch. So we're in a critical juncture, and while people may be very annoyed at the Irish processing sector having to bring in fish from other countries and saying we should process our own fish, we are flat out processing our own fish. But unfortunately, the policies that have been in place, and particularly now with the TCA, there isn't enough fish to process. So the alternative is you downscale your entire sector, job losses, factory closures, or you seek alternative sources of fish. And we need to keep the processing sector robust. We're 160 processors, which is quite small. Over 85 of those 160 processors have a turnover of less than $1 million. So 50% of the sector is small in European terms, critically important in terms of our own members, our own nation here. So there is massive challenges there. And all the time when we're facing all those challenges, we have a government that won't implement energy measures in line with other EU states, won't look at the option even that's put forward by the EU Commissioner and voted on by the Parliament. So it's very hard to reconcile all that and still remain optimistic or have confidence in our political system. But we must do that, and we have to remain confident that whilst at present things are in a dreadful state and there's a lack of political leadership and there's a lack of political initiative, things do change in the political world almost instantly when the stars align, if I can borrow that phrase. So we're still optimistic that things will take a turn for the better. At the minute, there is an absence of political leadership on the issue of energy crisis and having an effective policy at European level, I might add.
This common fishery policy review, it's written into EU legislation that there has to be this review. That's why the Minister has put together this committee. Yet now we heard from DG Mari saying that it's not going to be a review, that they're going to hold out because they're only starting to implement the common fisheries policy. We seem to be just in this sort of a flux of EU legislation, the Irish government talking about stuff, and it seems to be very hard to find a way forward to improve anything.
Well, you're 100% correct. There is no review, and the EU Commissioner, when he was in Killybegs in September of 2021, clearly stated that in the lifetime of this Commission, there's going to be no review. They'll consider possibly a review in the lifetime of the next Commission, with a view maybe of having it commence in 2026, 2027. So the reality is there's no review, but sure, that's part of the con job that goes on between what our government are telling us of what the EU is insisting on them, and yet when we go to the EU tell us a different story. So this using one against the other is the narrative that has allowed the industry to decline, because it's impossible to determine where the truth lies. But I think that is changing, because some of the commissioners that have been appointed, particularly in the last cabinet, are very much into transparency of the EU project, as opposed to the nonsense that's been gone on, where there's tic-tac being played between member states, departments and governments and the EU Commission. I don't know how many times I've heard different ministers and different governments blame everything on Europe. I'm beginning to wonder now, if we had invested more time in finding out what Europe were really thinking, perhaps then we would have got a clearer picture of where the real problem lay. But in terms of the review, there is going to be no review in the foreseeable future. And that reflects the reality of Europe. We're a very small player, even though we have the largest territorial waters in Europe. We've allowed ourselves to diminish to such an extent that we're a very small player in maritime and EU fishing. The big players, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, even the Belgians are bigger than us now. They're going to dictate pace over there. And not alone that, but they've invested heavily in lobbying at European level. They've invested heavily in having the connectivity that we don't have. Our footprint in terms of Europe is 0 to 0. You know, and you have to ask the question, where was successive governments for the past 15 years that allowed that to happen? That we have no imprimatur, we have no pressure that we can apply in terms of maritime policy, in terms of fisheries policy. That's the reality. Some might try to say, oh, we have this and we have that and we have the other. We have damn all. We have damn all. You know, we have no levers of power there. And the big players in the fishing policy will dictate what happens in the common fishery policy. And that's the reality. And we're not even on the subs bench. I think we're at this stage, we're carrying the bags. We're down to the baggage boys. That's all we are.
We're talking about the common fisheries policy and the way it's been manipulated and everything is out there. Surely, like, the Irish people should know more about really what's happening, but our international press doesn't seem to really want to get involved in it.
The reality is there has been a failure to understand the true value of the Irish asset, the fishing industry. And through successive governments, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, when we allowed fishing to be reduced from a mainstream department of government to 1/3 of a department, which it is now, and we decentralized it to Clonakilty, and we allowed to have it without any degree of change for the past 20 years. If you were to do that with any other sector, the same thing would happen. It's a recipe for failure. when you allow something was key in terms of potential, in terms of innovation and development. We never realised the true development potential of the Irish fishing industry. And as it said, if you're to do that with any successful sector, the outcome would be the same. So in terms of where we are with Europe, I would still apportion 90% of the failure of the Irish fishing industry to lack of political leadership, the failure to renew and bring in new personnel that had innovation, that had development as their drive instead of regulation. We're fixated on regulation. We are absolutely fixated on regulation. If you look at the SFPA, they must have about 160 people working on it in terms of an industry that's worth 800 million. The Dutch industry is probably, when you take all their subsidiaries in other EU states, it's probably worth 3 billion. And as we discovered, they have 2 fisheries officers looking into the entire pelagic sector. And that's the reality. They're working on the same control regulations as we are. It's the one fishing control regulations that's right across Europe. That's how they interpret it. Here you have a scenario where you are over-regulating to a point that you're driving people from the industry, you are harassing people, and you're choosing to over-regulate one fleet, which is the Irish fleet in this case, while ignoring other member states that are fishing in our waters, that are landing into our ports, that are exporting from our ports, and you're choosing to over-regulate 15% of the catch while choosing to ignore 85% of the catch. And no one can challenge me on that, because those are the facts. I remember a marine publication, I think it was in 1990, and that's a fair while back. They published that at that time, 90% of the landings, the control landings, the SFPA weren't even founded at that time, was on Irish vessels. And yet, percentage-wise, they were such a small number of the boats that were fishing in the Irish EEZ. It came into existence in 1989. So this is a historic reality that's going on, that we drive the Irish industry to the seabed. We nail them to the seabed. And it's sad. It's really sad because, as you know, I come from a political background and no politician had the balls or backbone or brains to take it on. Perhaps we're going to be in a climate of change in the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, and maybe that'll change. But at the minute, it would lead you to despair when you look at the potential that we've lost and the opportunity that's foregone. I should be talking here about an industry that's worth 6 or 7 or 800 million. I should be talking about here, if we do this right over the last 20 years, the Irish fishing industry should be worth 3 billion, and it should be employing 40 to 50,000. But that is the opportunity that we lost through stupidity, narrow-mindedness, and the failure to realise that we had the greatest fishing asset in all of Europe, because we were too narrow-minded and we were led by a pseudo policy that the Irish were crooked.
So on that happy note, Brendan, is there anything positive to say?
Well, when you get to rock bottom, there's only one way up. But the journey back is going to be dictated by, can we have an honest discussion? Can we have an open discussion on what the real problems are in the Irish fishing industry? And if we do have that right discussion at political level and sort out our domestic problems before we go to Europe, I can safely predict that within 10 years, even with the common fishery policy, not reviewing, there's still potential there that we can seize on. I keep referring to the Seafood Task Force. In time, that will be seen by the Irish people as the greatest lost opportunity that was in our lifetime. Because we had a terrific opportunity where finance was being made available through Europe, but we didn't approach it in an open-minded fashion. We went down the same narrow rabbit holes that we've been in for the last 20 years, and that was very much policy-driven. Policy is killing Irish fishing industry. It has killed it for the last 20 years. It's killing it currently. Until someone wakes up and say, there's better potential there. There's a generation that can really take this industry and bring it to the place that it should have been for the past 20 years. But we can bring it there in the next 10 years if we have an honest discussion as to the elephants in the room.
Brendan, thank you very much for joining us again, and we'll have you back next month to have an update on what's happening. So we'll chat to you then.
Thank you very much.